welcome to episode 15, part 2 of Knitter Matters. Thank you very much for joining us today. I really do appreciate you taking the time to do that. So welcome, and welcome too if you're watching later. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant with Style Matters International, my company, and I've had two passions in my life, which are sewing and knitting. And of those, knitting is the thing that I find relaxes me. It's my therapy and I love it. I used to also have a yarn store in Brighton called Yummel, which means hair of the sheep. And it was my pleasure then to teach people how to knit, and it's my pleasure now to teach you how to knit. You can follow us on Facebook, of course. We're on Instagram too. And this video and all others are uploaded afterwards, not just to this page, but to our YouTube channel. And thank you everyone that's helped us get to over 100 subscribers on YouTube. That's very exciting. I'm going to ask the camera to turn to the workstation now, and I'm going to take my seat and we'll get on with what we're doing this week, which is jogs and joins and the magic loop, part 2 of our knitting in the round, or our circular knitting. So while the camera moves, I will too. I'm also going to take my glasses off. At this point, I see better without them. Okay. So, last week we looked at circular knitting in its various forms. We took a good hard look at the needles that we need to use, and we looked at how to join the knitting, which is seamless, haha, pardon the pun, but I also explained how important it is not to get the stitches twisted in that initial first row, because once they're twisted you end up with a Mobius loop, which is great if that's what you want, but not if you want a tube of knitting, which is what circular knitting is all about. Anyway, I did say that there's certain things in circular knitting that you don't have with flat knitting. And they're little issues that aren't enormous, but we need to be able to fix them. Jogs are one of them, and joining, how to join. Jogs are little steps like this when you join and cast off. They're also, I'll come to that in a minute, but they also feature elsewhere in knitting. But these little steps, these don't worry me. I tend to actually sew those in afterwards. You've always got a tail there anyway, which you have to do something to. So it's pretty easy to just kind of sew that in and make that seamless there. That's essentially what I did with this. So you don't, you've got to sew it in somewhere. Yeah, I can feel that that's where it was. So it really, that's what I tend to do. But if you don't like that, or you want an alternative, there's a couple of things you can do. You can actually just knit a couple of rows on with your circular needle, with your stitches on. You can just knit a row or two and then join and sew up that little seam. You can also do that if you're finding joining in the round as a beginner, if you're finding that tricky. And if you're using quite fine yarn and lots of stitches, it's very easy to get that twisted. So it's not a bad idea to follow that technique. So just knit a row or maybe a couple of rows, and then you can join. You've still got that tail that you need to sew in, so you can then sew up that little seam at the end of it. If you don't want to do that, or you want to find another way, I'm going to show you a technique called a crossover technique. So what you would do, I've cast on a bunch of stitches here, and I've used really big fat needles so you can see what I'm doing. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to slip my first cast on stitch, which is in my left hand needle. I'm going to slip that to I'm actually going to slip it this way, then you can see better. I'm going to slip that to my right hand needle. Okay, that's my first cast on stitch. Then my last cast on stitch, I'm going to put the tip of my left hand needle in and pass this over the slip stitch. I am not taking it off the needle, I'm not decreasing, but you can see here how those are crossed over, and then all I need to do is knit my row. Let me show you again. Okay, so this is my first cast on stitch on my left hand needle. I'm going to slip that. I'm actually going to slip it purlways on this instance so you can see better. I'm going to slip that to my right hand needle. This is my last cast on stitch in my right hand, and I'm going to slip that over that stitch. Oh, don't come off the needle. So I've now got, you can see that those are crossed over, okay? And then all I would do is carry on knitting. I would put a marker there too, so I know where my join and my row starts. But you can see already you've got actually a really smooth join there. So that technique looks a bit scary, but it's actually very simple. So just remember that first cast on stitch, which is on your left hand needle, you slip that to the right hand needle, then you insert your left hand needle tip into the last cast on stitch and pass that over the stitch and onto your left hand needle, and then you can knit. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do. Let's really get on to the business of these jogs, where you lovely stripy tubular fabric here. Don't know what I'm going to make with it. This is my sample, but I really like how lovely those stripes are. But when I come to where I have joined, or sorry, gone to the next row, you get this jog. And it's particularly noticeable in stripes. And the reason it happens is because although we call it circular knitting or knitting in the round, you're actually knitting in a spiral. What you're not doing, you're not knitting a circle, then coming up a stitch, knitting another circle, then coming up a stitch. You're not sort of finishing each round. You're knitting in a series of spirals, and that's really noticeable when you get stripes. So you might be able to disguise that. If it's on a side seam, it might not bother you. If it's near an armhole, it might not bother you, but it could do. And the more stripes you get, the more you kind of notice that. So there's a couple of techniques, and I'm going to show you one which I use all the time, and it's really simple. I'm going to demonstrate how to do this. So you knit your stripes, you get to where you're changing the colour. You change your colour. Sorry, I'm told I need to get nearer so you can see better. So as you can see, I've done exactly the same on this sample as what I've done here. I've cast on, I've done a few rows. But can you see here how actually it's almost seamless? There's no jog. Compare the jog here and here to here. There really isn't one there. This is so simple. You'll wonder how you ever did without it. You'll never be afraid to knit stripes in the round again. And this applies to various other patterns too, but stripes is a very good demonstration for it. So I've got to where I'm changing the colour for this darker stripe. I've knitted one row. I'm just going to finish off that row to where my stitch marker is. Don't forget your stitch marker, it's very important for knowing where you are. So what I do now, so I've done a whole row of knitting in that second colour. So all I'm going to do now, and I will just take this marker off. I would normally move it to the right hand one, but I'm just going to take it off so it doesn't get in the way. You put on your needle tip, you go to the stitch below, that lines up with the first stitch of that second colour stripe, or however many colours it is. You put that on your needle and then you knit them both together. There, you see? I'll do it again for you because it is a bit different to something we would normally do. Let me just, let me get to where I need to be. Oh, I've dropped a stitch there. Okay, now you're going to see me fixing my drop stitch. That's okay. This happens. Right. Oh no, I'm right. No, I'm not. Sorry. I need to get that back on. Okay. There we go. So I've done it one whole round in my second colour. I'm going to the right hand leg, if you will, of the stitch below the start of that row. I'm going to pop that on the needle, then I knit both stitches together. You're not decreasing, that's important to remember. You're not decreasing. All you're doing is getting a really nice, smooth, jogless join, okay? I need to just tighten that up a bit. Okay, that's better. There we go. And as you knit, you'll see that that's even better as you go on. So every time you change a colour, just do that technique. Really simple, really easy. And you'll be glad with those results. Okay. So, excuse me while I just take a sip. When we looked at circular needles, I said that there's lots of different lengths and you measure them from tip to tip. So you measure your circular needle from tip to tip. That's the length of your circular needle. But there are times when you just haven't got a circular needle that's small enough. So that might be things like fingers on gloves, socks, soft toys that you're making, where you need a knitted tube. Then you have to switch to double-pointed needles. And I showed you how to use those. I'm not a fan, as I said. If you are and you love double-point needles, keep using them. I had a lady during the week say, does that mean I have to switch from circulars from my double points? No, you don't. If they work for you, keep knitting with them. It's just one of those things, they don't work very well for me. I find them difficult. I've got to change, constantly change into another needle. There's always the opportunity to get kind of a stretched out stitch or a ladder where you don't want it. I find it difficult. So when you need to make a small tube, there is another technique and it's called the magic loop. And this doesn't involve double-pointed needles. So if you're like me, you'll go hooray of that. The technique was, I think you'd say unvented. So it existed, but it was sort of brought to or refined by a lady called Sarah Hashka, and it was described in a book by Bev Galeskis called The Magic Loop, not surprisingly. And it's a wonderful technique. It's very clever. It's very simple. It just takes a bit of practice, but it means you can do really tiny little tubes like this, and smaller, of course. So you could do the fingers on gloves, and it means you really only need one length of circular needle too. For this, you'll need a 32-inch length circular. Remember, they measure from tip to tip, so you want a 32-inch length circular. You can go bigger depending on the size of tube that you're doing. But remember, the point of this is really that you can do small tubes of knitting that you otherwise couldn't do on a circular. But nevertheless, it is a technique that you can use on all sorts of things if you wish to. And if you don't have a collection of different needle lengths, then it's worth knowing this, because there's going to be times when you need to know this technique. You can certainly use longer. It really depends on the project. I do know people that have used a shorter length, 24-inch length. I've tried that. It's a little bit tricky, can be done, but 32 seems to be the sort of optimum size. So I'm going to show you what this looks like, and then I'll show you how to do it. So, because it's a bit weird. What we actually have, and I'm going to bring in a piece of white card here so that you can clearly see, because wouldn't you know it, this particular needle has got a black loop. So this is my 32-inch length needle. I've cast on something like, what have I got, 30 stitches here, something like that. So I would normally have to do this on double point needles. And I've divided them on both sides. This is what I call your starting point. Remember that, this is a starting point. Now what I'm going to do now is my yarn is at the back on the back needle. I'm going to pull this needle through. Let's put that there so you can really see what's happening. Now I'm going to carry on knitting. So you could have a stitch marker there at the start. I took mine out so that it's not falling off. So I'm going to knit this first bunch of stitches. This is my first sort of 15 stitches here, okay? And I'm just doing a knit stitch. Remember, if you're knitting in the round, you don't have to purl unless you want to get a garter stitch, which is what I've done at the bottom. Right, now I've run out of kind of needle and I've run out of stitches. So what am I going to do now? This is where the trick that I find that I remember what to do, because there is a point in this where you say, I have no clue what to do now. And I love this technique, but I often have to remind myself how to do it because I don't use it that often. And then when I do, it's like, oh yes. So now you turn the work back to your starting position and you pull out the cable this way. Get that out of the way. I'm going to do it again so you can really see. I'm going to do this a couple of times, and this is where I've got a join here that isn't that good. Okay, a join on my needle that's a bit sticky. So I'm back to my starting position. I've got my cable here. Okay. I've got my yarn at the back. Now what do? Because if I had double pointed needles, this is where I'd bring in my third needle. I don't have that, I don't need that. I pull this one through and round. So essentially I've got a loop here and a loop there. That's why you need something like a 32 inch. Because if it's much smaller, you're not going to have much room for manoeuvre. So now I knit. Now whether I'm doing knit or purl, it doesn't matter. Whether you're doing a pattern, doesn't matter. I'm knitting. And I always give that first stitch a little tug, just so that I don't get a kind of gap or a ladder. And when I say ladder in this context, I'm not talking about a drop stitch, I'm talking about kind of a gappiness that goes down, often when you change needles. So now I'm knitting again, my first 15 stitches. I've run out of needles and stitches now. This is where, if you turn it straight round to your starting position, you just remember what you're doing. You pull this through, get those stitches back onto your needle tip, and start again by pulling that through, getting that over the back, and I'll do one more line of stitching, as it were, so you can see, and you just keep going. The only downside to this technique, if you're working on a lot of stitches, which then you probably don't need to, because you could have a circular needle that's the size that you need for your project, you've got to keep pulling the cables through at each end. And over time, it's going to take a bit of a toll on the cables of your circulars because you're constantly pulling them, okay? So I've done that. So back to this again and back to the starting position. Okay, I'm not going to keep knitting on this, but you're going to say to me, or I hope you'll be saying, that's wonderful, Cheryl. What a lovely technique, but how do I get started on it? Oh, gosh, that one sticks. Okay, there we go. So we're back to where we were then. We're back to our starting position, okay? That's the magic loop technique. I'm going to take this away and I'm going to show you how you start off. I have already cast on, this is another 32-inch circular needle. And I have cast on, what did I cast on here? Doesn't really matter. Maybe 40 stitches, can't remember. So with the best will in the world, I'm not going to be able to, start knitting over here with this. I mean, I just can't get round it, and I'm going to stretch my knitting, even if I could get that around it. I'm not going to do that. What do? Well, you run your stitches onto the cable. So even if you've only got 10 stitches, maybe it's a thick yarn, you've only got 10 stitches, whatever it is, you run them both, you run it onto the cable, okay? Then you find sort of the halfway point. Sort of, it doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be, if I've got 40 stitches here or 20 stitches, whatever I've got, it doesn't have to be exactly in half, thereabouts. Then you pull this out, the cable out, and you get your needles and your stitches in that starting position. Okay, right? You want your working yarn at the back. Okay. You do want to make sure that your stitches aren't twisted. And then you start, and you pull this out and start. Now, I'm just going to show you again how I got there. So I've got my line of stitches on my nice springy needle. Okay. I find roughly my halfway point. Then I slide my stitches to both ends of my needle. So I've got it on the needle tip now. I want to make sure that's not twisted. Well, you will when you start knitting. You don't want that twisted for the reasons we said before. Right, okay. There we go. So I've made sure that's not twisted. I'm ready to knit. So I pull this one out. This is the bit that people kind of get a bit flummoxed because it's like, oh, what do I do now? Pull. That's why always at the starting point, your working yarn is there. You pull the back one out and you bring this round. Let's make sure your yarn is over the needle there. Okay. It's easy to get into tangle, but that's all you do. Now I would place a stitch marker there. Pull nice and tight on that so you don't get any sort of loose bits. But again, you can work those in if you do afterwards. Okay. So that's how you start your magic loop. Okay. And so on, exactly what I did just now. So you know what to do now. That's how to start the magic loop. Okay. So how are we doing? Oh, right, okay. So we're kind of finished a little bit earlier today, but that's okay. That's good. I hope you enjoyed those little techniques. They do take a bit of practice, but as always, practice makes perfect. Progress is better than perfection. Don't hesitate to let me know if you have any comments. Put them on the Knit Matters Facebook page. I'll always be happy to answer those questions wherever I can. And next week, we've got some exciting news to announce for Knit Matters, so do make sure you join us next week. In the meantime, stay well. Stay safe, keep calm, and do keep knitting. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye for now.